Press that subscribe button, smash the like button, and watch the video. FarmBoys podcast with Kennedy Nate, prestigious lawyer at the Ray, Quinn, and Nebaker law firm in Salt Lake City. Take 4.
Everyone loves to see someone who's successful fail.
Anyways, sorry. I went off on a tangent there. Anyways, I went a lot of different ways, Chris. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
As soon as people stop being greedy and start being honest, I'll be out of a job.
One of the top questions that was on Google was, how do I know if I'm to a point where I need a lawyer? So is it true verbal contracts are just like written contracts?
So an agreement on an email that is tracked, can that be enforced as a, hey, here's a contract?
Kennedy, you could argue this one way. That's a great question.
And that's usually where most of the fight ends up taking place and where most of the money is spent. Dear Kennedy, do you ever get tired of threatening people? It really isn't necessary. Thanks.
Do you notice in our society, though, it seems like people are definitely guilty until proven innocent these days?
Absolutely, especially in the media. Because lawyers have a bad rap, and rightfully so.
I mean, these things affect people. And if you have a person that isn't a great communicator or maybe they're a great thinker, but they can't get it out when they're talking to somebody. So I think some tips on like just basic negotiation. Maybe the one that, most people are going to have jobs, like maybe what's the suggestion on somebody going in and trying to negotiate their own contract?
People on social media tend to think I can say what I want without repercussions. Right? As an attorney, I sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution. And so enforcing the laws of the United States is very important to me.
You do agree, though, from what you said, that we have to have borders or else it could turn into chaos.
Absolutely. Well, laws are passed to be upheld. If you ignore the law, look, sympathy and empathy and all those things have to be taken into it. But if everyone just gets to ignore the law because they have a sad story, that's just not the way the law works.
It's true. We got all the network marketing companies, Chris. Tech has been here in Utah for quite some time.
Pardon the hotel in the backdrop.
You could have at least put your bag up.
You know what? I probably should. Like, my bed's a mess. I sleep on, this one over here. I don't know where to see it. There we go. Yeah, I got a bunch of clothes on there and everything, and that's the one I sleep on. Huh?
You were doing that on purpose. Kennedy,
I sleep in this one over there. FarmBoys podcast with Kennedy Nate, prestigious lawyer at the Ray, Quinn, and Nebaker law firm in Salt Lake City. Take 4.
Kennedy, are you here in Utah or are you somewhere else?
I am. So I'm in Cottonwood Heights area.
Okay, right on.
Yeah. How about yourself?
I'm in Utah County.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I say that tongue in cheek. I love Utah County. I have a sister that lives there, and so my mom grew up in Utah County in a tiny little farming community called Genola, Utah.
So the podcast that we're doing is called FarmBoys, right? Chris and I both grew up on farms. So we like to bring in the farm effect, the farm connection, and we found it real quick, right there.
Oh, yes.
So your mom grew up on a farm. You used to go visit the farm. Chris, well, maybe before we dive into this, I was going to ask Kennedy, did you go help out on the farm, or did you want to start out with some different stuff, Chris?
No, go ahead. Let's go. Let's roll.
So would you go help on the farm? Like, was your grandfather, was he still farming, or your grandparents, were they farming when you were young?
So by that point, my grandparents weren't so much, but I had an uncle that lived next to them, and they had, as a kid, it seemed like a fairly sizable piece of land. I really don't recall quite how big it was, but I used to love it. That was my favorite thing in the summer, was to go out there because, as a city kid, going out milking cows, picking up eggs, all that kind of stuff that was just mundane lifestyle for people living on the farm, my cousins. Man, it was so much fun for us. And I look back and I laugh now because I'm sure they were like, it's great when our city cousins come because they'll do all our chores for us and they'll think it's fun.
I have city cousins from Utah that used to come to Idaho and help out. And eventually my cousin that was just a little bit younger than me, cousins on both sides, they enjoyed to come out and get the farm experience. We enjoyed having them out because it was just, it was like having a cousin sleepover every night, and then it kind of breaks up the mundane day, that we were used to. But I think for farm kids, and Chris, I'll let you jump in here after this, but from my perspective, the farm never turns off.
Yeah.
And we grew crops in the summer. We had cattle as well. So in the winter, the cattle are home from the summer pastures up in the mountains. And so we're feeding the cows every day. When the cows start calving, we were making sure that everything was going smoothly with that. If there's cows that needed help I learned a lot about life and a lot about it, what it was like to work, but the farm never turned off.
Why don't we start off with you telling us about yourself, where you went to school, credentials, anything else, anything that you think would be intriguing or interesting for people to know about you.
Yeah, sounds great. Happy to do so. So I'm a Utah man through and through. Grew up in Utah, was born in the Cottonwood Heights area. So grew up, I'm a graduate of Brighton High School, attended the University of Utah, where I got an undergrad degree in Spanish. Initially, went to law school thereafter, went to the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah, and thought that I wanted to do immigration law. That was kind of the thought that I had going into law school. And obviously, totally changed. I do absolutely nothing immigration-wise now. And I will say largely that was because I did a couple of free immigration clinics and learned very quickly that everybody has a sad story and a lot of them are in really tough situations. And found that, it just wasn't the right fit for my personality. So I gravitated, I would say about 6 months into my studies at the University of Utah's law school, more towards business law, and found something I really loved. I love, the opportunity to go and litigate. I love legal research and analysis, and playing, what I like to call, 3D chess, thinking through everything, and trying to figure out how to, analyze all these things, and found a real knack for it. And so I kind of shifted my focus to more of a business litigation approach, and finished up law school. I graduated in 2012. And it was immediately picked up by what I will describe as kind of a high stakes plaintiffs litigation firm here in town. And the firm's changed names a few times, but it got training from some of the best lawyers in the business doing high stakes commercial litigation. Got into the courtroom very quickly, and have been doing that kind of law ever since. And it's been now, I think, 12 years since I passed the bar. So been doing it for a few years.
All right. Well, we can't let immigration, especially with what's going on now. And I didn't expect this to go this way, but let's do it, man. So I'm not going to ask you your political beliefs. Okay. If you want to share them, that's fine. I don't mind at all. Immigration. So I know you to be a very empathetic, you're a good guy, like Kenny, I know that you try to do the right thing. You're very conscious. You're my lawyer. You're very conscious of who you deal with, how you treat them. So seeing and hearing those stories of immigration, number one, where do you stand on open borders or closed borders? And number two, how does those stories affect how you believe politically?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. And I will say it's a hard one. I think because there really is, a desire for a lot of people to come from other countries to live the American dream. And whatever that American dream is, it depends on the person, right? And I know there's a lot of back and forth, social media, news on there is no American dream, blah, blah, blah. Well, if that weren't the case, I don't think people would actually want to come here. And so that's just my personal opinion. And as a young law student, hearing the stories of these people who came to the United States, it was heartbreaking. I mean, as you said, I'd like to think that I'm empathetic. I'm a lawyer, so I have a little bit, not as empathetic as maybe most people are. But it was very compelling to hear. And the reason I say that is because most of the people that I interacted with were those who were brought over by their parents or by family members when they were young. So they really didn't have much of a say in the matter. It was, live in whatever, Latin American country they came from by themselves, which obviously not an option, or come along with their parents or their families who brought them along. And they came here, they grew up, in the United States for the vast majority of their lives, and they wanted to find a path forward so that they could become citizens of a country that it was basically the only country that they knew. And those, for me, were probably the hardest ones, because they came over here through no fault of their own. They didn't know that they weren't necessarily in compliance with the laws or not. And they really, were just trying to find a path forward. And what I quickly learned is that, with some exceptions, it's very difficult if you're here and you're not here through legal means to make that transition to becoming a citizen or obtaining a green card, unless you return back to your country where you originated from. Now, the law may have changed. We're talking 14, 15 years ago, and because I didn't pursue it, obviously don't know too much about immigration law now, but that was something that really formed, I would say, my view on that. And so, obviously, as an attorney, I sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution. And so enforcing the laws of the United States is very important to me. The one thing I wish is that there was a little bit less political football with the immigration issue and a little bit more proactive work between the various political parties to try and figure out a solution, because I don't think it's as hard as everyone makes it out to be. And there should be a way for people to immigrate legally to the United States. I'll be honest. My ancestors came over in the mid 1800s from England and from that area. And, back then, immigration may have been a little bit easier. I'm not sure, but there was a lot that they had to do to come here. And I just wish, I would say from my perspective, I wish there was an easier way to make or to allow people who want to come here legally to do so. And there are ways. There are ways to do it, but oftentimes when you're looking at months or year-long waits versus starving right now with children you can't provide for, it's a no-brainer, right? I'll break a law and I'll come and I'll do whatever I can to provide for my family. And if that means I'm in violation of, the laws of the United States by coming over illegally, so be it. But at the very least, I'm here and I can provide for my kids and they can get something to eat. And so it's a tough situation. I would say, Chris, kind of going back to that point, is I do think that upholding the law is very important, because without law, it devolves into chaos. But unfortunately, because it's a political thing, at times that's how it's used. It's not used to help and benefit the lives of the people who are trying to better themselves. Instead, it's used as some sort of a political argument, one way or the other. And I'm not going to tell you where I stand politically on it. I think that's kind of a middle road answer for you. And you can tell I do this for a living. I dance around the issues and give you an answer that sort of gets you there, but maybe not all the way. So I hope that satisfies you.
No, I think that's good. I told you we're not into trying to force people to share anything they don't want to, but I think it's really compelling. I feel like I know you, but like that just all of a sudden stood out to me. Like, oh wow, we just got some information. Like we got something good here. No, I think it's interesting. Wow, that's crazy. Logan, did you serve your mission in a Spanish-speaking country?
Romania.
Oh, Romania. Gosh, I have so many LDS friends that I'm not. All my friends are LDS. They've all served missions. I know I've had
Chris,
one or two.
Let me jump in. You might be thinking of me because I served one in Peru, and so living 2 years in a Latin American country, I definitely saw firsthand kind of the way things are there, and it helped me gain a greater appreciation as to why people would want to come to the United States, any way they could. So.
Yeah.
You do agree, though, from what you said, that we have to have borders, or else it could turn into chaos.
Absolutely. Well, laws are passed to be upheld. If you ignore the law, look, sympathy and empathy and all those things have to be taken into it. But if everyone just gets to ignore the law because they have a sad story, that's just not the way the law works. And unfortunately, I see that all the time in my profession. Is people have compelling stories as to why, they took a trade secret, or why they copied someone's trademark, or whatever. And at the end of the day, if you don't uphold the law, it becomes chaos.
So how do you determine what cases you want to take and which ones you don't? Because there could be some pretty good actors out there that really make you feel bad for them.
Fantastic question. And I will say that I generally take work on a referral basis. I would say about 98% of the work I get comes from people who I've worked with before. Chris, you yourself were referred to me by another lawyer who I knew and trusted. And when I got that referral, I don't know if you remember, it's going back, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 years, but we had some initial intake calls. We talked about things. Obviously, won't go into depth on what that was, but my general sense is that, when a potential case comes in, I always give a free consultation, and I think most lawyers do. There's some that don't, but I think that's generally the practice here, at least in the Utah bar. Particularly so you can kind of investigate the merits of the case that's coming to you. And I think any good lawyer, what they do is they will look at the things that they're told. They'll talk with their client, figure out who they are. I mean, it's a little bit less this way since COVID, but meet with them in person and hear their story, and then vet the things that they tell you, because it's pretty quick and easy to spot some of those who are coming in with a get-rich-quick scheme, something that doesn't add up, and over time you get a little bit better at sussing those out and figuring out what it is. But that's kind of my process. Because I work primarily on referrals, it's a bit easier because I usually am getting work from people who I know and trust, and I know they wouldn't be sending me cases from people who are not on the up and up. I'll put it that way.
So 2 things here. What is the number one thing you see that's getting referred to you, or people coming to you? Business law, because that's what you practice in, or something else? And then can you state who you currently work for?
Absolutely. So I'll go in reverse order for you there, Chris. So I currently am a shareholder at Ray, Quinn & Nebeker, one of Utah's longest standing law firms. It's a great place. I love it. I've been here just over 2 years, almost 3 years, and it's been a fantastic experience. And in terms of what I see most for my line of work, I would say breach of contract, just because no business can function these days without some sort of a contract. And business moves forward. People think they're not getting paid enough. People don't want to abide by the things that they say. And sometimes there's just genuine disagreement between the parties on the things that are within the contract. I mean, the English language can be imprecise. It can have different meanings based on where you're from. And so there are occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, honest disputes between parties relating to what those contractual terms are and what they mean.
So when you say the English language can be interpreted different ways, are we talking Bill Clinton? Like, what is like? Are you talking something like that, or is it craziness, or is it like real legitimate? Wow, I understood it to be this, or I understood it to be that. Can you explain more about that?
Absolutely. I've seen both ends of the spectrum. I've seen people quibbling over what is, as we saw our former president do. And I've seen very complex issues like, what is the definition of a certain, like let's say in a very technical industry, I do a lot of work for dietary supplement companies. And so sometimes there's questions over what comprises a formula, what type of information in a formula is considered to be confidential or trade secret. And it varies from place to place, formula to formula, and business to business as to what they consider to be proprietary within the scope of their business. You can see when people are playing games. I mean, and the good news, I can't speak for, other jurisdictions, outside of Utah, but we have phenomenal judges generally here who can quickly sniff out those who are playing games. And so it's not something that happens as often here locally. And I, do some practice. I practice primarily in Utah, licensed here at the Utah bar, and then also in the federal courts here. But I've also handled cases in, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, California, some in Idaho as well, and other locations around the United States. And I will say Utah, we do a pretty good job here in terms of what I would call sniffing out the ridiculous arguments and getting to the crux of the case. Not always the case, but because we generally have really good judges here, that tends to be something that is good to see. And so you don't see as many of those. Well, what does the mean? Objections, because they won't stand for that kind of gamesmanship.
So are there a lot of supplement companies in Utah that are creating their own proprietary blends, or what's going on with that?
I would say, aside from Ponzi schemes, dietary supplements might be one of our biggest and most historical, forms of business here. And I say that tongue in cheek, but Utah. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Logan.
It's true. We got all the network marketing companies, Chris.
So like Juice and type of companies like that?
Juice and Newskin and doTERRA. Those are, Newskin and doTERRA are huge, but there's a lot of other ones as well.
Young Living.
That's the one.
So there's a lot of the multi-level marketing that happens out of Utah, or network marketing, as Logan said, where, people tend to sign up with these companies and then sell stuff. I will say the work that I have done historically for dietary supplement companies has not been in the multi-level marketing arena. I worked as in-house counsel for a company for about a year called Nutraceutical Corporation, which was previously a publicly traded company and had a number of different brands, very long-standing, very well recognized. And so I saw it kind of from the more, I will call it the more legitimate side of the dietary supplement business. Not to say that multi-level marketing isn't legitimate, but it tends to be more fraught with, risk and people selling things not because of the quality of the product, but to increase their downline or increase, their monthly payout.
So I worked for a company up in Idaho that had that model, and I think network marketing, multi-level marketing, whatever you want to call it, I think is extremely powerful. And it's incredible the types of relationships that people, like regular people, have with people of influence. It's incredible how fast and how powerful it can be when you have an army of people that are willing to talk about your product. And, there's usually like you said, Kennedy, there's usually a financial incentive tied to it. So sometimes these pitches and this information, it's just like anything. You hear a story from somebody, you're super excited about it, maybe a member of your family, you're with your good friend a few days later, and you're like, hey, I just heard this story, and here's the story, right? And you share the story with your friend, and it's mostly the same that you heard, but it might change just a little bit. Maybe you...
Telephone game.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Kind of, right? And so it kind of takes on a life of its own. But where I wanted to go with all of this is tech has been here in Utah for quite some time. There's a lot of different supplements and products that are made in Utah. So it's one of those things where I don't think we can talk too bad about it, because it's created so much. I think it's created a lot of industry and opportunity for people. And they call, I-15, especially through Utah, it's kind of like network marketing row or multi-level marketing row. And there's a lot of conventions and conferences that happen in Salt Lake and different things. But I think it's created a tremendous amount of opportunity for the entire state. Anyways, sorry, I went off on a tangent there. Anyways, I went a lot of different ways, Chris. Sorry about that.
Yeah. I want to derail for a second, and I want to do something new, and we'll put this as our own thing, and we want to do the lightning round here. So Logan, we didn't talk about this before. I've got a set of questions here, and if you can think of some questions, but I want to rattle them off, Kennedy, and I want you to answer with the first thing that comes to mind.
You got it.
So this FarmBoys podcast lightning round. So first one, what's the most ridiculous lawsuit you've ever heard of?
A lawsuit ever heard of?
Yes.
Or been involved in?
Let's go with each. Heard of and been involved in.
So the one that makes me laugh the most is every time you get a package that has the little silica beads in it. Have you ever noticed how it says "do not eat"? Yeah. There's a reason for that. Lawyers, right? Because somebody somewhere ate it at some point, and they got sued for it, right? When you look at a lot of the cautions that exist on products these days, it's because somebody got injured or did something that wasn't anticipated by the manufacturer, and they got hurt by it. So any types of those are some of my favorites.
It was in the food. It was in the, don't they put them in like the jerky and all that? I mean,
yeah, they're in basically every type of packaging you see for, everything, food, clothing. I've seen it in all sorts of things. And every time I laugh about it. I mean, I think the one that everyone goes to or talks about the most is the hot coffee at McDonald's lawsuit. Now, that one to me isn't as ridiculous because apparently the coffee was extremely hot. It was unexpectedly hot. I don't purport to be an expert on that case, but there's a lot of what I will call personal injury cases that have led to some funny things because people do things that you don't anticipate with products that weren't made to do what they're doing with them.
So coffee, energy drinks, soda, what's your go-to through a long case?
Oh, I typically will go to a yerba mate. I love yerba mate. So I think it's the Guayaquil is the one who makes it here locally, and they're my favorite brand.
Did you drink that in Peru?
I did. That's where I got a taste for it. My family tells me it tastes like dirt, but I love it.
It kind of there's kind of an alfalfa taste to it, a little bit.
I don't know. I've not tried alfalfa, but I can
kind of an earthy
the smell.
Okay, we're not getting the idea of a lightning round here.
Oh, sorry, guys.
Quick,
sorry, yes.
complete answers. Legal drama, better on TV or better in real life?
Better on TV.
Oh. Really?
Oh,
I'll
yes.
even pause for that one. Okay. If you weren't a lawyer, what career would you be?
I would honestly be a farmer. I love the land. If I could go you're laughing at this, Chris, but what you don't know is a few years ago, my wife and I bought 30 acres in Wyoming with the hope to retire up there and start a little small farm.
We'll come back to that. Favorite legal movie or TV show?
My favorite one to quote, Liar, Liar, because there's fantastic one-liners to use all the time in every lawsuit. Your Honor, I object because it's damaging to my case.
Okay, last one. What's the craziest objection you've ever heard of?
My favorite crazy objection is when someone asks a question, doesn't like the answer they're getting, and they object to their own question. And that happens more often than you would think. A lawyer asks a question that's not properly formulated, they start getting an answer that's damaging, and then they object to their own question.
Wow. All right. Well, not bad for your first lightning round. Our first lightning round. Not terrible. That's interesting for sure about the Wyoming property. Of course, I don't know that because what Logan and I have spoken about previously on our podcast is that farming is very sexy and attractive to people who have not had to change hand lines, set siphon tubes, be in a tractor for 10 or 12 hours without a cell phone, with nothing out there, no phone at all. You're by yourself. If you're lucky, some little cutie from high school knows you're out there because you called her on the landline and said, I'm busy, I'm going to be in the tractor. We're at right by my house, and they just show up and you get a ride with them in the tractor, of course. Let's say the average lawyer charges $300 per hour. Is that close? One of the top questions that was on Google was, how do I know if I'm to a point where I need a lawyer? How should somebody determine if they need to seek out a lawyer?
If you think you need a lawyer, if you're asking yourself that question, you need a lawyer. You need to talk to somebody at the bare minimum just to find out whether you actually do. Because, and I think, we've talked a little bit about this, people can only approach things really from their own perspective. And unless you've been involved in the law, a lawsuit or something like that, you generally don't really know when you need a lawyer, because a lot of people believe that they can work things out. And lawyers make a lot of money off people who try and work it out themselves, and then it doesn't go well.
So you're saying it could cost somebody more money to try to do it by themselves than to actually go to a lawyer first and foremost?
Absolutely. And I would say one of the first things that jumps to mind on that is in a contract. If you've got a very simple run-of-the-mill contract, you're probably fine to use something that's fairly standard. But if you have any level of complexity, like, for example, you're selling products across state lines, or if you're selling products to various different parties, you want someone to take a look at that to make sure that you aren't giving something up and you're not being taken advantage of. And if something goes wrong, you know what your potential exposure is. Because that little bit of money up front on a contract, call it $2,000, $5,000, $10,000, could save you hundreds of thousands of dollars in litigation on the back end. As soon as people stop being greedy and start being honest, I'll be out of a job, right? And I say that's tongue in cheek, because there are those who have honest disputes over interpretations of contracts. But the problem is everyone's in business for one reason, and that's to make money. And so if you think you can get an advantage with those that you're dealing with, you might build it into the contract. And if they're not savvy or experienced, they might miss it and it could come back to bite them.
So is it true verbal contracts are just like written contracts?
In terms of enforceability, yes. So verbal contracts are enforceable. They absolutely are. The hard part comes in establishing what the terms of the contract are, right? Because you have one person saying it's X, another person saying it's Y. And so it can be very difficult to kind of nail down what those terms are.
I have a question with that, Chris.
Absolutely.
So along those same lines, so an agreement on an email that is tracked, can that be enforced as a, hey, here's a contract? I've heard people tell me before, like, hey, make sure you send it as an email. Like, hey, we've talked about it. Yeah, we agree to it. And somebody's like, well, just send it to me in an email so I have it in writing.
That is, I think, a good strategy, because when you have these types of verbal agreements, it's amazing how people's minds, sorry, and I'm losing my backup light here, so I'm probably a little bit dark now, but
you're good.
And people, their memories fade. They don't remember what was there. And we all tend to have a bias towards our own perspective. We think that we remember it correctly, right? Yeah. And so send that email. When in doubt, send that email confirming what the terms of the agreement are, because then you have something that you can say, this is what we agreed on and this is what's written down.
Chris, I have another question kind of along those lines. I had heard that if you have an invention that you've come up with, you can you can mail yourself. You can put the plans down and then mail it to yourself to prove like this was, because it's stamped with the date. So if anybody ever comes out with it, it's a way to protect it and say, actually, I came up with this back in, such and such date. Does that, I don't know. Have you heard of
that? I will tell you, that's outside my area. I've got a good buddy who does patent type law, and he would probably know the answer off his cuff. I candidly don't know. I mean, it goes to show that you had the idea first, but that's about the extent of my knowledge when it comes to ownership or priority on those types.
Kennedy, you could argue this one way. That's a great question. Come on, have you heard that? I've heard that. Have you never heard that?
That's the first time I've heard it. Never heard it before.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard it. Like Logan said, like what a great, because I've heard that. Like I can write down on a napkin, it gets taken, and all of a sudden, I back myself up. I put it on email. So if somebody else gets it out there because maybe I lost it on a piece of paper or something, and I'm afraid somebody's going to rip it off, like I'm showing that I have it. That's it. I can't believe you never heard that one before. That's interesting.
I have not. I'm going to have to go look it up, though. And I will tell you what, first phone call I'm going to make after this is I'm going to call my buddy and see if I can find out the answer, because he'll know off the top of his head.
Yeah. But like we said, you're not an expert in everything, but you're a lawyer. And we do appreciate the honesty rather than, well, that depends. So,
well, that's what it depends. Those are classic.
No. Because it really does. But, okay, so the email versus the verbal versus the written. Rank them from strongest to weakest.
So strongest and most enforceable is obviously a full-blown, written out, negotiated contract. Why? Because it is recognized for hundreds of years as being kind of the quintessential hallmark of what an agreement is. Next best, I would say something in writing, whatever it may be. Whether it's a term sheet, whether it's an email confirming what the agreement is, that becomes very helpful because, as I said, usually the hardest part of a verbal agreement is what did the parties actually agree to? And that's usually where most of the fight ends up taking place and where most of the money is spent. And so verbal contracts on the very end of being, strength wise, those are the toughest to enforce.
What if there's no response to the email?
So if you, for example, were to send an email saying, hey, Logan, you and I agreed to X, Y, and Z. Please let me know if you have a different understanding. If Logan doesn't respond, then it's presumed that he didn't have a disagreement with what you said. That's the argument that you would make.
And then if he argued I never got it, or else I would have argued,
then it builds in some lawyer area to argue about everything, which is what we do. I mean, that's one of the things I will say, I guess kind of a little tangent for myself here, is one of the things I've learned to really appreciate practicing law is learning to see things from other people's perspective. As people, we only have one perspective. It's ours. We have our own experience growing up, our own experience in business, our own experience in marriage, friendship, whatever it may be. And so one of the most difficult things to do is to step outside your perspective, your bias, and try and see things from somebody else's perspective. And as a lawyer, I do that all day long. I try and understand the arguments the other side they're going to make, what evidence they're going to rely on, how they interpret the evidence. And that's probably, the thing I love most about my job is it helps me to peek into other people's minds as we go through the battle every day.
How long do people have to file a lawsuit if they think they've been wronged? Is there a statute of limitations? What's general rule of thumb?
Yeah, so statute of limitations, and I'm sorry, Chris, depends on the type of a lawsuit. So generally speaking, it ranges anywhere from 2 to 6 years. Very high level is what you're looking at. And 6 years is generally, the longest, but those are typically for written breach of contract in Utah. If something has happened, you've got 6 years to enforce it, 4 years for a verbal agreement, and then different types of actions like personal injury, things like that have slightly shorter statute of limitations.
How often do you see people that are able to settle things without going to court?
Well, first off, most lawsuits end in a settlement. And so it's only the very rare exception that cases actually go to trial and get decided either by a judge or a jury. So kind of from the get-go, most cases, and I don't know the exact statistic, but it's something like 96, 97% of cases settle outside of court, and it might be higher. So almost from the get-go, if you file a lawsuit, the odds that you will end up at trial are very, very slim. And so, that just goes to show that most parties end up settling cases before they actually have to try it. Those that don't involve lawyers, that's a tough one because I'm not involved, and so I can't really ballpark.
Yeah, so that was maybe poor. Okay, they start out with lawyers, and then somehow they come to a resolution without the lawyers involved, even though they brought them in initially.
I would say maybe, a quarter of my cases or the matters I've handled will end up that way. But there's a reason for that, is because really when you're fighting over something, each side is trying to decide what they can live with. There are some cases that are what we call bet the company cases or principal cases where it doesn't matter the cost, it doesn't matter whatever. Their job is to go and fight this thing to the end because they need to get a resolution. They're right or they're wrong. But I would say more cases, maybe 50, 60, 70% of them are those where people are making sound business decisions, trying to figure out what they can live with, and the other side is doing the same. And so the lawyers help you understand what the law is, what you can or can't do, what arguments you can make. And something that I'm a big advocate of is when you've kind of run the bounds of what the law can be, see if you can get people to sit down and have a conversation. Because if you do, a lot of times people can hash it out and figure it out, what they're willing to do, because the lawyers, if they're doing their jobs, have advised them as to what the parameters of the law are. And then people can do it. Now, I would say that tends to be on smaller dollar number cases. So if you're looking at a little bit less money, that tends to be a bit more effective, including because people don't want to spend money on their lawyers to do all that talking for them, right? But when you get into more complex, higher dollar disputes, lawyers tend to take the lead on it. And so it's kind of a sliding scale, but I do think that what we need more of is parties trying to work it out and talk with each other, and less of lawyers exchanging mean emails or letters back and forth about what they're going to do to the other side.
Have you ever sent a mean email, Kennedy?
Oh, yes. I definitely have. And I will say, the older I've gotten, the less I try and send those type of missives. And I won't share who the lawyer was, but I sent a very aggressive email in some pretty acrimonious litigation about 10 years ago. And I got a response from a very seasoned senior lawyer who'd been practicing law for 30 plus years. And it was so short and to the point, I committed it to memory. So I'll share it with you. It said, "Dear Kennedy, do you ever get tired of threatening people? It really isn't necessary. Thanks." And it stuck with me, right? Because I was like, oh, maybe he's right. Maybe his 30 plus years of experience, I should have just picked up the phone, given him a call, and we could have figured out whether or not my concerns were valid without, a 5-page email that I had some pretty strong allegations as to what I thought his clients were doing.
I don't want to get too personal here, but when you say things like this, it makes me think, okay, you went on a mission. Is there ever times when your religious faith ever comes into play when you're dealing with cases? Like, I'm actually surprised, and I haven't known you for all that long, but I've known you long enough that I'm shocked that you were that aggressive to do that, having worked with you. But you're LDS, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. So has that faith, going on the mission, does that ever kind of sneak its way into anything you do ethically, legally?
I would say absolutely. And I would say the older I get, the more I tend to try and be a little bit less aggressive in my initial approach. Now, not to get too religious here on you, Chris and Logan, but in the Bible, we see various different personalities of Christ. We see the Christ who is tender and loving with the children. We see the Christ who's in the temple kicking some butt, right? And so I view those as kind of the two spectrums, and it depends. What I've learned, though, is that oftentimes when I was young and hot-headed, I'm not that old, but just hit 40 this year, and so I like to think I'm a bit, more mature. When I was in my 20s, it was, get hot-headed, ticked off, go really aggressive and attack, because people will think that I'm a good, strong lawyer if I attack and I go on the offensive really quick. With age, perspective, and a little bit of wisdom, I've realized that not every case calls for that. There are cases that call for it, where you need the bulldog lawyer, the quintessential bulldog lawyer, as you hear about. And there are others where you need someone who has the client's best interest in mind and is being very careful in how they approach the case, so as not to cause the walls to jump up on both sides and make it a battle of, well, I'm right and you're wrong. Now, that happens. I can't say that doesn't happen in litigation. It does all the time. But I am a little bit more cautious before I jump in with those super aggressive emails nowadays.
I know you're not a criminal attorney, but are there criminal acts where you would be willing to say, hey, I'm going to defend this person, like, I'm passionate about this, this is horrific, I'm going to help this person, whatever that might be?
So easy answer for me. Yes, I think if people do certain, types of crimes, it would be very hard for me to represent them. I think, for example, crimes against children, things like that would be very, very difficult for me to represent them, just because of my personal morals and things like that. Now, that being said, I want to be clear, Chris, is that one thing I have learned and what I have gained, because I get that question a lot: how do you deal with lawyers that represent child molesters, rapists, murderers, like things like that? And I get that question, and it's caused me to think a lot about it. And what I can always fall back on is, once again, I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, and so did every other lawyer who's out there. And even though someone is accused of something absolutely horrendous, they have constitutional rights, and those constitutional rights should not be violated, even if they're guilty. And in fact, maybe less so if they're guilty, because you want to make sure that people's rights are being upheld. Once again, it goes to that issue of protection under the law, because if you start playing favorites with one side, or you start picking on somebody, as we've seen in history and in other countries, it leads to serious problems where everyone is at least hypothetically or supposed to be equal under the law, and they're treated as if they're innocent until proven guilty, then the system works properly. But it's easy for me to say because I'm not in the trenches.
Right. Do you notice in our society, though, it seems like people are definitely guilty until proven innocent these days?
Absolutely, especially in the media. If somebody catches wind of charges that are filed against somebody that seem, particularly interesting or very obscene, and it gets exploded on media, social media, it becomes very difficult to overcome that bias because everyone presumes, well, if they got charged, they're obviously guilty.
I would say there's a bias more towards men than there are women. And having said that, you're not a divorce attorney. Somebody who's in a divorce, male or female, how would they go about if somebody doesn't know the process on, hey, I'm in a bad situation, I want to go consult an attorney, I don't have any money. How would you advise somebody to get out of that situation and go get help from an attorney?
I think first thing that pretty much everyone can do, and I'll speak a bit more as to Utah, just because it's what I'm more familiar with, and I'm not sure what's outside of the state. But in Utah, we have a phenomenal law library at the Matheson Courthouse in Salt Lake City, Utah, where anybody can walk in at any time and they can get assistance from law librarians who are there and can get questions answered. Alternatively, you can go online and go to the Matheson Courthouse or Google Utah Courthouse, and there is a lot of self-help items that have been prepared by the court system to help people understand what their rights are, what they can do, and how to start out. And in fact, there's a lot of information about divorces, how to start the procedure, protective orders if you need one. And so that is a fantastic resource, is the court's website. There's a lot of information there. And then if you need more in-depth help, I would absolutely recommend going to the courthouse itself and talking with some of the clerks there, because they would be more than willing to help you, and that's why they exist. A lot of people don't know about that, though.
No. So you're saying they can almost take the place of an advising lawyer, so they don't have to feel like, hey, I've got to go see a lawyer. These folks that work at the library can actually legally advise them on steps to take and what to do?
So they can't say, hey, here's application of the law to the facts of your particular case. But if you have questions, for example, I'm in a bad situation, I want to file for divorce, how do I do that? They can walk you through the steps. Husband or wife is abusive, I need a protective order, how do I do that? They can show you how to go through it, file it, get everything in front of the judge. And so they can walk you through the mechanics and identify the laws that protect your rights. And so it's a fantastic resource.
So I think this is very important for people everywhere. It doesn't matter where this podcast gets seen. What if they don't have that that avenue like we have in Utah? I mean, are people able just to go see a lawyer, maybe call, make an appointment to say, hey, I just need a free consult. I think I may need to get a divorce. I think I may need a protective order from my spouse. Is that possible in other states? And will lawyers do what you kind of do and give maybe a free consult if they're in that kind of trouble?
I would say most are, and if with the right amount of effort, and I don't know what that effort is from location to location, you should be able to find someone who will give you that initial consult to make that determination as to whether you need a lawyer, and if so, whether you can afford that particular lawyer. Now, one of the things I do like about my profession, and I respect greatly about my colleagues, is when a client comes to me looking for divorce advice, I'll talk to them, I'll tell them I can't help them, but I'll get a little bit of information so I know what's going on. And then I've got 5 or 6 lawyers that I can think of that I can refer them to talk about maybe their particular situation. And in my experience, lawyers tend to be very, very good that way in sharing, referrals, passing people off to other good lawyers that they know. And so it can be intimidating to call up a law firm or to meet with a lawyer. I would say don't be intimidated ever. Talk with somebody. The worst they can tell you is no. The best, they might be able to help you. They might be able to take it pro bono, or they might be able to connect you with either pro bono or low bono type attorneys that can help you out.
Describe what those two are. What you said, pro bono. Yeah, please describe that.
Yeah, so pro bono is when legal services are offered for free. So some lawyers do it, some big law firms do it. It just kind of depends on where you're at. And then there's other, like we talked about, going to the courthouse here in Salt Lake, you would be able to go and ask questions, and the advice you're getting is considered pro bono. Low bono is not free, but it's at a highly discounted rate. And so sometimes lawyers will make exceptions for certain types of cases, and they'll help people out in a way to do it. And I will say, I mean, because lawyers have a bad rap, and rightfully so, I try and keep 1 to 2 pro bono cases going at all times, just as one of the ways that I can give back. It's tough because I get a lot of referrals, and oftentimes when people see the cost of litigation, it can be absolutely shocking. And so, I think most law firms out there have resources to help people like that. A lot of the bigger law firms have incentives to younger lawyers to do pro bono work so that they get the experience, they're able to help out, and they're able to get mentored by senior lawyers at the law firms. And so there's a lot of different resources out there. It's just not being afraid to kind of dive in and ask those questions as to where you can go.
You have anything that's coming to mind, Logan? Issues that you can think of that our everyday folks want to know?
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that came to my mind a little bit earlier, and I didn't know how much time we'd have now. I mean, I was even thinking if it's a more of a lengthy thing, maybe that we could talk about it in detail another time. But I was going to ask around, just like with your education, with your training and everything that you do, Kennedy, I think one of the things that people deal with on a regular basis is just kind of like simple negotiation. If it's going in for like to buy a car, if it's, talking with someone on KSL about something that you've seen that you want to buy. I think there's certain people that just don't like that process. Like, I do not want to haggle with somebody. There's some other people that are like, I love this process. Like, I love to haggle. And there's people all kind of, in the middle. But from like an educational standpoint, is there any, and that's why I say, I mean, we could probably go into a whole different session and just talk about this. Like, hey, here's some tips for you in negotiating a work contract, I mean, these things affect people. And if you have a person that isn't a great communicator or maybe they're a great thinker, but they can't get it out when they're talking to somebody. So I think some tips on like just basic negotiation. Maybe the one that, most people are going to have jobs, like maybe what's the suggestion on somebody going in and trying to negotiate their own contract and how you position that. And it's probably different depending on if you're already at a firm and you're trying to get like, a better contract with the existing firm, or, I've found in my career, the times when I get the highest bumps in pay are the times when I've changed jobs, because I know this is my opportunity to get, like, I'm not going to go there unless I get what I want. So I don't know if you can talk about that, or Chris, maybe we even want to extend it and talk about that another time, because we could talk about a lot of stuff with that.
No, yeah, I mean, I want to have Kennedy on again. We don't have to do it monthly by any means or anything like that. But if you're willing to come on again, but if you can take a few minutes and talk about those tips, I think that'd be huge for this podcast to add in there. I think that's something everybody would like to know. I think that's great info. If you're okay with going a little bit longer,
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Work contract, or
I would say the first thing is know what you want. I mean, because it's very difficult to negotiate unless you know what you want. And so if you know what you want, then you can develop a strategy. And that seems really simple, right? But sometimes people go into a negotiation without a clear plan of where they want to go or what they want to achieve. And so if you can figure out, obviously, work contract, I want a job. It's more than that. What do you want in the job? What do you want your benefits to look like? What do you want your pay scale to look like? What do you want your vacation to look like? All these types of things. Have at least an idea of where you want to go in the negotiation. Number two, and I this is a tough one because it's hard to teach, but believe in the position that you've decided on. I mean, I thought your point was fantastic, Logan, that the biggest pay bumps you see is usually when you move from one job to the other, because you know how much you're worth. And that worth you've built up at the place where you're at sometimes isn't seen because it's incremental. But when you go outside, people see, oh man, this guy brings so much value, we're going to pay him what he wants. The thing that's hard when you're internal and you're there is going and saying, hey, I bring all this value, you need to see it, pay me more. I think that's a harder situation, but and that was a little bit of a side path. But so I would say point number one is know where you want to go. Point number two is believe in yourself. And then number three, most important, is say what you want. Sometimes people don't get the type of terms that they want in an employment agreement or whatever because they're afraid they're being too greedy. I can't tell you how many times people cheat themselves out of money at the start because they're undervaluing themselves and they're afraid to ask for what they're worth. Now, you may not get the response that you want, but then that will tell you something about the person you're interviewing with. If they don't value you like you value yourself, it should be a sign that maybe that's not the job for you. Now, not everyone's lucky enough to have those types of options, but at least then and you're going into it eyes wide open.
Would you say those same things apply to like a business agreement? I mean, do people go in not knowing what they want that you see and they, all of a sudden now they're in court, or maybe on the other hand, they overvalue themselves and instead of undervaluing themselves? I guess, how does that your points for like an employment contract, do those carry over, or would you give different pointers to like a business contract of, hey, I want to, and it's very generic, I get, but I want to, form a partnership with this company A and company B. What do you see there?
So still kind of the same points. I mean, knowing what you want out of the agreement, I think, is always key. So for example, if you're entering into a partnership, what's the split of the work going to look like? Who's going to invest the capital? Who's going to run the business? How is it going to operate? Who's going to manage the books? Like knowing some of that nitty gritty stuff is, I think, really important. I mean, it's great to start with the big picture. This is what I want. I want a partnership with this person. Okay, how do we envision this partnership looking? And if the more thought you can put into that on the front end and describe it up front, the less trouble you'll have on the back end because things are spelled out. And generally, when you're entering into contracts, people are excited. They're willing to work with each other. It's something they want to see happen. And so people look at things a bit more rosy, right? And they look at it like, okay, yeah, we can make this work. I can do this with you. It's a bit more collaborative. But when things blow up, people tend to, hunker down in their positions and they view things only the way that they want to. And so it becomes a bit harder at that point to get your point of view across. But yes, I agree. This is something we could talk about at length, guys.
Yeah, for sure. So I did want to ask one last question before we let you go here. And it has to do, and this doesn't have to be a long answer by any means, but do you see a lot of things happening due to social media these days, whether it be in your realm, in your law firm's realm? Is social media played any type of a role in new litigation that obviously wasn't there before this came, a different type of litigation, different type of cases coming around?
Yes, and I'll share a couple funny examples that I don't think it's necessarily changed. I mean, there's definitely been changes with the development of technology and the types of litigation that's there. But one of the things that's, I've seen a lot of is people on social media tend to think I can say what I want without repercussions, right? People get on there, they say exactly what they're thinking, and they think, I got that person, right? And they engage in these online discussions and whatever. Well, the problem is if you write or say something that is, for example, defamatory or is threatening, there can be consequences, even though it's on social media. Another area where, I've seen it happen, and I don't do this, but I've affiliated with and worked with a couple of lawyers who told me stories about this. people who claim to have been injured. They file personal injury lawsuits. They can't work because their back is bad. And then the next week, they're posting pictures of themselves on the beach surfing in Hawaii, right? So people tend to tattle on themselves using social media. And so I think it just creates a new dynamic, for lack of a better way to put it, because people are so familiar now with it that they tend to put and say kind of whatever they think on there without thinking things through sometimes. And it can be very reactionary. And so what you're getting is a lot of unfiltered, unthought out posts that show up. And then always remember that the internet is forever, right? When you post something out there, it is virtually impossible to get it taken down or to remove it. And so we've seen this with celebrities who 10 years ago said things that were not necessarily, violative of the political correctness spectrum. And 10 years into the future, it's now getting them into trouble. And so it's one of those things to just keep in mind is what may be appropriate now may not be appropriate in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and it could come back to bite you.
That actually scares me. That actually scares me. So, all right, I'm going to do our little blurb here, and then we can let you go. But